What if I told you that 8,000 years ago, you could have walked from London to Amsterdam without ever getting your feet wet? Beneath the churning waters of the North Sea lies one of archaeology's greatest mysteries, a lost landmass larger than the United Kingdom itself, where Stone Age hunters once thrived in a landscape that rivaled the Garden of Eden. This is Doggerland, Britain's real-life Atlantis, and today we're diving deep into its incredible story. From the moment the last ice age began to retreat until the catastrophic tsunami that sealed its fate forever, we'll uncover how an entire civilization vanished beneath the waves, and why scientists are calling it the most important archaeological discovery you've never heard of. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Your support means we can continue producing these highly researched videos to help you learn something new or pass the time. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? The Lost World Beneath the Waves. Picture this. You're hauling fishing nets through the cold waters of the North Sea. The trawl comes up heavy. When you empty it onto the deck among the flopping fish, something catches your eye, a chunk of blackened peat. Then you see it embedded within a carved point of antler, barbed like a harpoon, impossibly ancient. This happened in 1931 aboard a vessel called the Kalinda. That single artifact changed everything we thought we knew about the geography of Northern Europe. Welcome to Doggerland, the lost world beneath the North Sea. For most of human history, nobody suspected what lay hidden under these dark waters. The North Sea seemed permanent, fixed, the way oceans are supposed to be. But that harpoon told a different story. Testing revealed it was roughly 13,000 years old, crafted when the sea was land and hunters walked where trawlers now fish. The name Doggerland wouldn't come until decades later. In the late 1990s, archaeologist Bryony Coles at the University of Exeter needed a term for this drowned landscape. She borrowed from the Doggerbank, a massive underwater sandbank that rises from the seabed about 100 kilometers off the coast. Dutch fishing boats called doggers had worked these shallows for centuries, never knowing they sailed above the hills of a forgotten world. That 1931 discovery sparked curiosity, but the evidence remained frustratingly scattered. More artifacts surfaced over the following decades. Fishing nets dredged up mammoth bones from depths where mammoths had no business being. Teeth from woolly rhinoceros, antlers from giant elk, stone tools worked by human hands. Each find added another piece to an impossible puzzle. The implications were staggering. If these land animals and their hunters once lived where the North Sea now flows, then the entire map of prehistoric Europe needed redrawing. The British Isles weren't always islands. Continental Europe once extended much farther west and north than anyone had imagined. Think about what this means for human history. For thousands of years, people walked between what we now call England and what we now call the Netherlands without ever seeing an ocean. The Thames, the Rhine, the Seine. These great rivers once joined together, flowing west through valleys that are now 100 meters underwater. Imagine the richness of that landscape, the forests, the wetlands, the abundance of game. Studies of similar Mesolithic sites around the North Sea's modern coastline suggest Doggerland wasn't just a corridor between more interesting places. Archaeological evidence indicates it was home, possibly the most densely populated region in all of Northern Europe during the early Holocene. The heart of Mesolithic culture, not its periphery. But here's the haunting part. Almost everything about these people lies beyond our reach. Their settlements rest under thick layers of marine sediment. Their hunting grounds sleep beneath shipping lanes. The landscape they shaped and knew intimately now exists only in seismic data and computer reconstructions. We know they were there because the sea gives up its secrets slowly. Beyond the Kalinda harpoon, trawlers have recovered hundreds of worked flints, bone tools, and fragments of wooden implements. Each summer, massive land reclamation projects along the Dutch coast pump sand from the seafloor onto beaches. Collectors walk these shores after storms, finding Mesolithic artifacts mixed with modern shells. These displaced objects are all that remain of communities that thrived for millennia. The geology tells us when this transformation happened. As the great ice sheets melted at the close of the last glacial period, sea levels rose remorselessly. The process took thousands of years, but it was irreversible. Doggerland shrank generation by generation, coastline by coastline. By around 6500 BCE, the rising waters had claimed most of the land, severing the British Peninsula from continental Europe. Some high ground persisted longer. The Dogger Bank itself remained above water as an island for perhaps another 1,000 years. We can imagine the last inhabitants watching their world disappear, retreating to ever smaller refuges as the sea closed in. Then came the Storegga Slide. Around 6200 BCE, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of what is now Norway triggered one of the largest tsunamis in recorded geological history. Recent research suggests that by this time, much of Doggerland was already submerged, reduced to low-lying islands and coastal areas. The tsunami struck these remaining lands with devastating force. Sediment cores from the southern North Sea show clear evidence of the event, layers of sand and debris that could only have been deposited by a massive wave. Traditional accounts assumed the Storegga tsunami was the catastrophic end of Doggerland, the final blow that drowned everything in a single terrible day. But newer evidence paints a more nuanced picture. The islands that survived the wave were eventually claimed not by catastrophe, but by the steady, patient rise of the sea over the following centuries. This is Britain's Atlantis, not a myth, but a documented prehistoric reality, a landscape that shaped human culture for thousands of years, then vanished beneath the waves. Unlike Plato's fictional island, however, Doggerland left evidence. Real bones, real tools, real proof of the people who made their lives there. Every artifact dragged from the North Sea poses questions. Who crafted this blade? What animal fell to this spear point? What stories did these people tell around their fires? The sea keeps most answers to itself, but the search continues. Modern technology, seismic surveys, remote sensing, sediment analysis slowly builds a picture of what was lost. And there's something else. Something that gives this story urgency beyond academic interest. Doggerland wasn't destroyed by war or famine or disease. It drowned. Climate change and rising seas erased it from the map. The parallels to our present moment are inescapable. Low-lying coastal regions around the world now face similar threats. The Netherlands, where so many Doggerland artifacts wash ashore, has been fighting the sea for centuries. They know what it means when water claims land. Doggerland reminds us that geography isn't permanent. Coastlines shift. Islands appear and disappear. Ice melts and reforms. The ground beneath our feet and the water at our shores exist in a constant, slow negotiation that sometimes tilts dramatically in favor of the sea. This is where our story begins, with fishing nets and fragments, with a drowned world waiting to tell its secrets, with the urgent need to understand how climate transformed Northern Europe and displaced the people who called Doggerland home. Maps of another time, reconstructing a drowned landscape. The problem seemed impossible. How do you map a landscape that's been underwater for 8,000 years? How do you see hills and valleys and river systems through 60 meters of dark water and centuries of accumulated sediment? For decades after the Kalinda harpoon surfaced, Doggerland remained more concept than place. Researchers knew something had existed there, but the actual shape of it stayed frustratingly out of reach. Then came an unexpected partnership between archaeology and industry. Oil and gas companies had been surveying the North Sea since the 1960s, searching for fossil fuel deposits beneath the seabed. To find these resources, they used seismic survey technology. The principle is straightforward. You send sound waves down through the water and into the layers of rock and sediment below. Different materials reflect these waves differently. By analyzing the returning echoes, you can build a picture of what lies beneath. The oil companies were looking for pockets of ancient organic matter transformed into petroleum. What they inadvertently mapped was the surface of a lost world. These surveys created massive data sets, thousands of square kilometers of seabed scanned in extraordinary detail. The resolution was fine enough to reveal not just geological structures, but topographical features: valleys, hillsides, lake beds, river channels. For archaeologists, this was treasure. Data that would have cost hundreds of millions to collect specifically for historical research already existed, paid for by commercial interests. In 2008, a research team led by Vincent Gaffney at the University of Bradford launched the North Sea Paleolandscapes Project. Their goal was to take this industrial survey data and transform it into archaeological maps. They began processing information collected by companies searching for resources, repurposing it to search for evidence of human habitation instead. The technical challenges were substantial. Seismic data comes in raw form, millions of data points representing sound wave reflections. Converting this into recognizable topography requires specialized software and significant processing power. The team had to identify which layer of sediment corresponded to the Mesolithic land surface, then extract just that information from the broader geological record. What emerged was remarkable. For the first time, researchers could visualize Doggerland as it had been. The maps revealed a gently rolling landscape, nothing dramatic, but rich in the kinds of features that would have attracted human settlement. River valleys carved through low hills, lakes collected in natural basins, wetlands spread across flat coastal plains. One discovery particularly excited the researchers. The seismic surveys showed an extensive river system draining from the southeastern section of the Doggerbank Hills. This wasn't speculation or interpolation. The river channels were right there in the data, preserved beneath the mud like fossils. You could trace their meandering paths, see where tributaries joined, identify where the watercourse widened into lakes or narrowed through valleys. Water draws life. Every hunter-gatherer society preferentially settles near freshwater sources. Rivers provide drinking water, fishing grounds, and highways for travel. They create diverse ecosystems along their banks, exactly the kind of varied terrain where hunting and gathering is most productive. Finding these ancient river systems told archaeologists where to look for settlements. The team created three-dimensional reconstructions of the landscape at different periods. They could essentially dial back sea levels and watch Doggerland emerge from the waters. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, the land reached its maximum extent. The entire southern North Sea was dry. As time advanced and ice melted, the maps showed the coastline retreating northward, the landscape shrinking. By around 10,000 years ago, Doggerland displayed a complex geography. The northern coast featured lagoons, salt marshes, and mudflats, exactly the kind of ecologically rich edge zone where Mesolithic people thrived. Inland, freshwater lakes and marshes provided abundant resources. The territory wasn't enormous, but it was prime real estate for its time. The maps revealed something else. Doggerland wasn't flat. Popular imagination sometimes pictures it as a featureless plain, but the reality was more interesting. The landscape had character. The Doggerbank formed a genuine upland area, hills rising perhaps 30 or 40 meters above the surrounding plains. Not mountains, certainly, but significant high ground that would have provided different resources and vantage points. In 2020, the Europe's Lost Frontiers project pushed this work further. Using research vessels, they collected sediment cores directly from the seafloor, long cylinders of layered material extracted from beneath the waves. These cores provided ground truth for the seismic surveys and revealed additional details about the environment. One particular core, designated LF0001A, proved especially valuable. Extracted from what had been the head of an ancient river system, it contained nearly continuous deposits spanning 3,500 years of Doggerland's history. The layers told a story. Lower sections showed peat from marshland, middle layers revealed lake sediments. Then came a distinctive band of sand and debris, evidence of the Storegga tsunami. Above that, marine sediments marked the final inundation. These cores allow researchers to do more than map topography. They can reconstruct environments. Pollen preserved in the sediment reveals what plants grew there. Microscopic organisms indicate whether water was fresh or salt. Organic material can be radiocarbon dated, providing precise chronology. The picture that emerged was of a landscape in transition. Early in the Holocene, around 11,000 years ago, Doggerland was cold but greening. Tundra vegetation gradually gave way to birch and willow scrub, then to more substantial woodland. The diversity of habitats increased: open grassland, dense forest, extensive wetlands, river systems, coastal zones. For Mesolithic hunters and gatherers, this was ideal territory. Different ecosystems in close proximity meant varied resources throughout the seasons. You could hunt forest game, fish in rivers and lakes, gather shellfish from coastal mudflats, and collect plant foods from wetland margins, all within relatively compact territory. The mapping projects continue. Every year brings new data, new cores, new details added to our understanding. Researchers now have good topographical information for large sections of Doggerland. They can identify specific landforms that would likely have attracted human activity: river confluences, lake shores, elevated ground overlooking wetlands. What they still lack are the settlements themselves. Seismic surveys can show you a hill or a river, but they can't directly detect the remains of Mesolithic camps. That requires different techniques and, almost certainly, direct underwater excavation. Finding preserved settlement sites remains the holy grail of Doggerland research, but the maps alone transform our understanding. Doggerland is no longer a vague concept or a blank space on the map. It's a real place with specific geography. We can visualize its landscapes. We can stand on the modern coast and picture where rivers once flowed and hills once rose. The lost world has a shape now, documented in databases and displayed in three-dimensional models. These reconstructions serve another purpose. They allow researchers to model environmental changes. By understanding exactly how the coastline shifted and the landscape transformed, they can investigate how these changes affected human populations. Where did people have to relocate? What routes remained open between regions? At what point did the British Isles become truly isolated from the continent? The industrial data that made this possible continues to accumulate. New wind farm developments in the North Sea require seabed surveys. Each survey adds to the archive. What began as a search for oil now serves the search for understanding. The technology designed to extract resources from the Earth instead reveals its history. The Mammoth Steppe, Doggerland's Ice Age beginnings. 23,000 years ago, at the peak of the last glacial maximum, ice sheets 2 kilometers thick covered Scotland and Scandinavia. The weight of all that frozen water compressed the land beneath, while so much water locked in ice caused global sea levels to drop by more than 100 meters. Where the North Sea flows today, a vast, cold plain stretched unbroken from Yorkshire to Denmark. This was Doggerland at its fullest extent. But don't picture it as a frozen wasteland. That's the common misconception. Yes, winters were brutally cold, but the landscape wasn't buried under glaciers. It was what ecologists call Mammoth Steppe, a unique ecosystem that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. The Mammoth Steppe formed a massive band of territory across the northern reaches of Eurasia, from modern France to eastern Siberia, from the edge of the ice sheets south to the mountains of Central Europe and Asia. This grassland tundra environment dominated. Doggerland represented its western extremity. The climate was dry and cold, but not perpetually frozen. Summers could be surprisingly warm. The vegetation differed from both modern tundra and modern steppe grassland. Instead of being dominated by a few species, it was remarkably diverse. Grasses, yes, but also a rich mixture of herbaceous plants, sedges, and what botanists call forbs, flowering plants like daisies and other low-growing varieties. Scattered stands of hardy trees, mainly willow and dwarf birch, survived in sheltered locations. This particular combination of plants could support enormous biomass. The Mammoth Steppe was more productive than either pure tundra or pure grassland. It created the ecological foundation for the most spectacular assemblage of large mammals the planet had seen since the dinosaurs vanished. Walk across the Doggerland Plateau during the glacial maximum and you would encounter giants. The most iconic was Mammuthus primigenius, the woolly mammoth. These weren't the largest elephants that ever lived, but they were superbly adapted to their environment. Standing about 3 meters at the shoulder, covered in shaggy brown hair with an insulating underlayer of fine wool, carrying curved tusks up to 4 meters long, mammoths were built for the cold. Their teeth tell us what they ate. Unlike modern elephants, which wrap their trunks around grass and pull, mammoths had teeth and trunk structures adapted for plucking short vegetation directly. Studies of frozen stomach contents from Siberian specimens show they consumed primarily grasses and sedges, exactly what the Mammoth Steppe provided in abundance. Sharing the landscape with mammoths were woolly rhinoceros. Coelodonta antiquitatis might be less famous than its proboscidean neighbors, but it was equally impressive. Stocky and powerful, with a thick coat of reddish-brown wool and a massive horn that could reach over 1 meter in length, The woolly rhino was the mammoth steppe's specialized grazer. Its skull structure and tooth wear indicate it fed on low-growing grasses, using that enormous horn to sweep aside snow and access vegetation underneath. Fossil evidence from across northern Europe, including bones dredged from what is now the North Sea, confirms these animals were common in Doggerland. During the glacial maximum, they would have migrated freely across the entire exposed seabed. There were no water barriers. From Yorkshire to the Netherlands was simply a walk across open country. The herbivore assemblage included others. Reindeer, adapted to eating lichen and able to survive the coldest conditions, roamed in large herds. Wild horses, smaller and stockier than modern breeds, but tough and well insulated, grazed alongside the larger species. Steppe bison, the ancestors of modern European bison, were larger and more heavily built than their descendants. Muskox, Saiga antelope, and the magnificent giant elk, with antlers spanning over 3 meters, completed the community of plant eaters. All these herbivores supported an impressive guild of predators. Wolves followed the herds. Cave lions, larger than modern lions and adapted for colder climates, hunted the open steppe. Hyenas scavenged carcasses and competed with other carnivores for resources. Even cave bears, though primarily omnivorous, occupied a predator niche in some regions. This ecosystem was extraordinarily productive. The sheer number of large animals the mammoth steppe supported was remarkable. Modern ecosystems simply don't match it. The African savanna comes closest, but even that doesn't quite compare to the density and diversity of megafauna that characterized the glacial period in Eurasia. And then there were the humans. Paleolithic hunters followed the herds into Doggerland. These weren't the first humans in the region. Archaic populations had been present during earlier interglacial periods, but around 25 to 30,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans occupied the exposed seabed alongside the megafauna. Life was challenging, but not impossible. The hunters possessed sophisticated technology. They crafted composite tools, wooden shafts fitted with carefully shaped stone points, joined with resin and bound with sinew. They sewed clothing from animal hides using bone needles, creating layered garments that provided effective insulation. They understood fire intimately, using it for warmth, cooking, and probably for driving game during hunts. The archaeological evidence for human activity in Doggerland during the glacial maximum remains sparse. This makes sense. Sea level rise has buried or eroded most sites from this period. What little we find comes from dredged artifacts or material discovered at the edges of the former landmass. But finds from comparable sites around the North Sea's modern coastline give us insight into how these people lived. They were mobile, following seasonal patterns of game movement. Small bands, probably extended family groups of 20 to 40 individuals that would have moved across the landscape throughout the year. Winter camps in sheltered locations, summer hunting grounds on the open steppe, seasonal gatherings at favorable locations where different bands would meet, exchange information, trade materials, and arrange marriages. The toolkit was standardized across vast distances. Similar types of stone blades and points appear from France to Siberia. This suggests extensive communication networks despite the sparse population. Information and innovation traveled across the mammoth steppe, carried by mobile groups who maintained contact over hundreds of kilometers. Hunting strategies were sophisticated. While opportunistic scavenging was certainly practiced, evidence from sites across Ice Age Europe confirms humans actively hunted even the largest game. Mammoth bone accumulations at some sites show patterns consistent with human butchery. Whether these represent successful hunts or clever scavenging of animals that perished naturally remains debated, but humans clearly exploited these enormous resources. The cold climate had unexpected benefits. It acted as a natural refrigerator. A mammoth taken in autumn could be partially butchered, the unused portions covered with stones and snow, then returned to over the winter. Frozen meat could be stored for months. As the glacial period progressed, conditions gradually became more severe. Around 23,000 years ago, the climate reached its coldest point. The ice sheets achieved their maximum extent. Human populations in many regions contracted southward, abandoning the areas closest to the ice. But not forever. The peak passed. Imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably, the climate began to warm. The Great Transformation was beginning. The mammoth steppes' days were numbered. Within a few thousand years, it would be replaced by forests, wetlands, and ultimately by the advancing sea. The Paleolithic hunters who had adapted so completely to the Ice Age world would need to adapt again or be replaced by peoples better suited to the coming changes. Doggerland was about to enter its golden age, though its days were already numbered. The Green Frontier, Doggerland in the Mesolithic Golden Age. Around 15,000 years ago, everything changed. The ice began its long retreat. Slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, the glaciers that had dominated northern Europe for millennia started to melt. The frozen grip on the land loosened. Life responded with explosive vigor. Doggerland transformed. The cold, dry steppe gave way to something richer and more complex. This wasn't a simple switch from Ice Age to interglacial. It was a prolonged period of environmental revolution that lasted several thousand years, and for human populations it created paradise. The first trees returned tentatively. Birch and willow, cold-tolerant pioneers, spread across the landscape. Behind them came hazel, pine, and oak. By 10,000 years ago, much of Doggerland was forested. Not the closed canopy jungle some might imagine, but a varied woodland interspersed with clearings, wetlands, and riverside meadows. The perfect environment for Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. The Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age, spans roughly from the end of the Ice Age around 12,000 years ago to the arrival of agriculture around 6,000 years ago. In Northern Europe, this was a time of remarkable cultural achievement. The people who lived through this period developed sophisticated technologies and intimate knowledge of their environments. And nowhere was more suitable for their lifestyle than Doggerland. Think about the ecology. Doggerland around 10,000 BCE had everything. The northern coastal zones featured lagoons, salt marshes, and mudflats teeming with shellfish, fish, and waterfowl. These transitional zones between saltwater and freshwater are among the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Everything that swims, flies, or grows in such places is edible and abundant. Moving inland, you'd find extensive freshwater wetlands. Reeds and sedges grew thick around shallow lakes. These wetlands attracted huge numbers of migratory birds in spring and autumn. Ducks, geese, and wading birds by the thousands would have stopped to rest and feed. For human hunters, this represented almost effortless protein. You could take enough waterfowl in a few weeks to smoke and dry for months of eating. The rivers were rich. Salmon and trout ran upstream to spawn. Eels migrated through. Pike lurked in the slower sections. Fish traps made of woven willow could be placed in streams and checked daily, providing reliable returns with minimal effort. The forests offered different resources. Red deer, the descendants of the reindeer that had grazed the steppe, now browsed on forest vegetation. Wild boar rooted through the leaf litter. Aurochs, the massive wild cattle that would later be domesticated, grazed in forest clearings. Hunting these animals required skill and planning, but they provided enormous returns. A single aurochs could feed a band for weeks. Plant resources became equally important. Hazelnuts appear abundantly in Mesolithic sites across northern Europe. They're calorie-dense, store well, and were available every autumn. Other nuts, berries, roots, and edible plants diversified the diet. The Mesolithic diet was surprisingly varied and nutritionally complete. Archaeological evidence from sites bordering what was once Doggerland reveals how people lived. They constructed substantial dwellings, not permanent houses in the agricultural sense, but solidly built structures designed for seasonal occupation. Post holes mark where they drove wooden supports into the ground. They would have built frameworks of saplings, then covered these with hides, bark, or thatch. Many sites show evidence of repeated occupation over decades or even centuries. People return to favorable locations year after year. This suggests a pattern of seasonal mobility within defined territories. A band might move between a winter camp in the sheltered interior, a spring fishing station by a river, a summer base near coastal resources, and an autumn hazelnut gathering site. The same circuit, year after year, accumulating detailed knowledge of every plant, animal, and geographical feature. Technology advanced significantly. Stone tools became more refined. The characteristic Mesolithic toolkit included microliths, tiny, precisely shaped stone blades. These were hafted into wooden or antler handles, creating composite tools. A fishing spear might have 10 small barbs set along its edge. An arrow could have a stone point sharp enough to pierce hide and flesh. The barbed antler points that first revealed Doggerland's existence are signature Mesolithic artifacts, crafted from red deer antler, carved with careful precision, notched with backward-facing barbs to prevent a speared fish from escaping. These tools show sophisticated understanding of both materials and function. Finds of similar points from sites around the North Sea suggest standardized knowledge spread across populations. Dogs had been domesticated by this point. The relationship between humans and wolves began during the Paleolithic, but by the Mesolithic, dogs were fully integrated into human societies. They would have been invaluable for hunting, providing early warning of approaching animals or people, and probably as companions. Bone fragments from archaeological sites occasionally showed dog remains buried with care, suggesting emotional bonds beyond mere utility. The social world was complex. Mesolithic bands were small, but they weren't isolated. Evidence from burial sites and artifact distributions suggests extensive networks. Materials traveled long distances through trade or exchange. Amber from the Baltic appears in southern sites. Flint from specific sources in what is now England reached what is now the Netherlands. These networks implied regular contact, probably annual gatherings where multiple bands would meet. Recent discoveries have revealed even more about Mesolithic people's spiritual and social practices. Human bone fragments dredged from the North Sea sometimes show unusual marks, cuts made after death. These post-mortem modifications suggest ritual treatment of the deceased. We don't know the specific meanings, but they indicate complex beliefs about death and the body. Genetic analysis of human remains from this period shows that Northern European Mesolithic populations shared common ancestry, but were quite mobile. DNA extracted from bones preserved in oxygen-free sediment reveals that individuals found in what is now the Netherlands had relatives in what is now Britain. Despite the absence of boats capable of ocean crossings, people moved freely across Doggerland, maintaining genetic and cultural connections across hundreds of kilometers. For these people, Doggerland wasn't a marginal territory. Recent research suggests it was the heartland, the richest, most productive environment in all of Northern Europe. Studies indicate it may have been the most densely populated region of the entire continent during the early Holocene. Not a land bridge connecting more important places, but the center of Mesolithic culture itself. The environment was remarkably stable for several thousand years. Sea levels rose, yes, but slowly. Coastlines shifted, but gradually enough that people could adjust. Territories changed, but resources remained abundant. For generation after generation, communities thrived in what was, by all measures, the best place in Northern Europe to live as a hunter-gatherer. It couldn't last. The ice kept melting, the sea kept rising, and far to the north, geological forces were building toward catastrophe. Hunters of the sunken plain, the people of Doggerland. We don't know their names. They left no writing, no lasting monuments, but they were there, walking the same ground, seeing the same stars, living and loving and working across the landscape we now call Doggerland. For thousands of years, they made this place home. Let's try to meet them. A Mesolithic band in Doggerland might number 30 people. Extended families form the social core. Grandparents, parents, children, aunts, uncles, cousins. The old carried knowledge, where the fish spawned, which plants were safe to eat, how to predict weather by watching the sky and the birds. The young carried energy and strength for the hunting and gathering that sustained everyone. Leadership probably operated through consensus and respect rather than formal authority. The most skilled hunters, the most knowledgeable plant collectors, the best toolmakers, these individuals would have had influence. But decisions affecting the group likely emerged through discussion rather than decree. Daily life followed seasonal rhythms. Spring meant rivers full of spawning fish. Nets woven from plant fibers could be stretched across streams. Fish traps of willow and hazel were checked each morning. Salmon running upstream could be taken by the dozens, then split open, smoked over slow fires, and stored. Summer brought abundance. Waterfowl nested in the wetlands. Eggs could be collected without impacting the bird populations significantly. Young birds not yet able to fly well made easy catches. In the forests, red deer dropped their fawns. Hunters watched and waited, knowing where females gave birth, taking young animals when opportunity allowed. Autumn was hazelnut time. This was critical. Hazelnuts provided dense calories that stored through winter. Whole communities would move to groves where the nuts grew thick. For weeks, they'd harvest, filling baskets and bags, processing the nuts by roasting them to dry, then storing them in pits lined with bark or hide. Winter was harder. Fresh food became scarce. Smoked fish and dried meat formed the dietary staples. Hunting continued when possible. Deer in winter are lean but available. Aurochs, the massive wild cattle, could be tracked through snow. A successful winter hunt of a large animal was cause for celebration and careful management of the resource. Tool-making was constant. Stone tools dulled with use. New points needed crafting. The flint knappers in each band were specialists, but everyone understood the basics. Children learned by watching and imitating. The sound of stone striking stone would have been as common in a Mesolithic camp as the ring of metal is in a modern workshop. They dressed in leather. Deer hides, carefully prepared through a labor-intensive process of scraping, curing, and softening, became clothing. Bone needles, small enough to pierce leather but strong enough not to break, allowed careful sewing. Garments were tailored to fit, sewn with sinew thread that held tight. Waterproof outer layers could be made from aurochs hide, warm undergarments from softer deer leather. Personal ornaments suggest these people cared about appearance. Perforated shells show up at sites around the North Sea, worn as beads. Carved bone pendants. Teeth from predators, particularly fox and wolf, were fashioned into jewelry. These weren't just decorations, they were markers of identity, skill, status. We're starting to understand their physical characteristics. DNA analysis from human remains dredged from the North Sea reveals European Mesolithic populations had dark skin and light eyes, a combination that no longer exists in modern populations. This makes sense given their position between Africa and the northern latitudes. The lighter eye color is an adaptation to low light levels, while darker skin protected against UV radiation during the brief but intense summer sun. One particular discovery brings us close to an individual. In 2009, Dutch researchers recovered a fragment of jawbone from material dredged from the North Sea. The bone contained a tooth. DNA analysis revealed it belonged to a man who lived approximately 8,300 years ago. Isotope analysis of the tooth enamel showed he ate a diet rich in marine resources: fish, shellfish, possibly seal. He lived in coastal Doggerland, making his living from the sea. This single bone fragment is precious. It's one of the very few human remains that can be definitively assigned to Doggerland itself rather than to sites on the periphery. That unnamed man walked on land that's now under 60 meters of water. He watched the sun set over hills that are now seamounts. He's as close as we can get to the actual inhabitants of the lost world. Social bonds extended beyond individual bands. Mesolithic societies maintained contact across vast distances. When bands met, usually in summer at particularly productive locations, they exchanged more than goods. Information about game movements, plant availability, tool-making techniques, and innovations spread through these networks. Young people found partners from other bands, maintaining genetic diversity. These gatherings likely featured feasting, storytelling, and ritual. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers show that when multiple bands meet, the social intensity increases dramatically. There would have been competitions, tests of hunting skill, perhaps races or games. Demonstrations of prestige, showing off particularly fine tools or rare materials acquired through trade. Music was almost certainly present. Bone flutes from Paleolithic sites prove humans made music for tens of thousands of years. By the Mesolithic, instruments would have been more sophisticated. Drums of hide stretched over wooden frames, rattles of shells or bones, the human voice raised in song. Spiritual life remains largely mysterious. We have hints. Some human remains show careful burial practices. Bodies were placed in particular orientations. Grave goods accompanied them: tools, ornaments, sometimes food. The cut marks on some human bones suggest secondary burial practices or other postmortem rituals. What these meant to the people who performed them, we can't know with certainty, but they demonstrate people thought deeply about death and what came after. One remarkable piece of evidence comes from the seabed near the Netherlands: footprints, Perfectly preserved human footprints captured in what was once soft mud near a riverbank. One set includes tracks from an adult and a child walking together, perhaps a parent and child. They walked side by side 8,000 years ago, and their footsteps remain. 39 prints in total, frozen in time, telling us these people were real. They had families. They walked together. The dogs that accompanied them left prints too, domesticated wolves that had become partners in hunting and companions in camp. These animals would have been mid-sized, similar to modern huskies or shepherds. They slept by fires, warned of approaching danger, helped drive game during hunts. The relationship between humans and dogs by this period stretched back thousands of years. Children in Mesolithic bands learned through participation. From early ages, they accompanied adults on gathering trips. They practiced with small versions of tools. They learned to identify plants, which were edible, which medicinal, which poisonous. They learned animal behavior, how deer moved through the forest, where fish gathered, when birds migrated. By adolescence, they were productive members of the group. Teenage boys went on hunts. Teenage girls gathered independently, processed hides, made baskets and cordage. Knowledge accumulated over lifetimes. The very old, no longer able to participate physically in the hardest work, contributed wisdom accumulated over decades. Life expectancy was lower than modern standards, but not drastically so for those who survived childhood. Skeletons from Mesolithic sites show people commonly lived into their 40s and 50s. Some reached 60 or beyond. Infant and child mortality was higher, but once past those vulnerable early years, people could expect reasonably long lives. They dealt with injuries. Healed bone fractures appear on skeletal remains. These people understood basic medicine. They knew which plants reduced pain or infection. They could set broken bones, stitch wounds with sinew, reduce dislocations. The survival rate for serious injuries would have been lower than in modern medicine, but it wasn't zero. What did they think about their world? We can only speculate. But the evidence suggests sophisticated intellectual life. The star patterns they saw were the same we see. They certainly noticed the movement of celestial bodies. They tracked seasons. They understood animal behavior at a level that takes modern scientists years of study to match. They possessed extensive botanical knowledge, which plants bloomed when, which were edible at what season, which could be used for tools, medicines, dyes. This knowledge was encyclopedic and essential. A mistake could mean poisoning. Correct knowledge meant the difference between hunger and plenty. They told stories. Every human culture tells stories. Tales of great hunts, of ancestors, of how the world came to be. These stories, transmitted orally from generation to generation, carried accumulated wisdom. They taught lessons. They reinforced social bonds. They entertained during long winter nights. And they watched the world change. Not in a single lifetime, perhaps, but over generations, the changes were unmistakable. The coast was closer than it had been in grandfather's time. Places that were once good hunting grounds were now marsh. Islands had vanished. The sea was coming. The rising tide, the first floods, and a shrinking world. The transformation happened slowly enough that no single person would have noticed much change in their lifetime. But across generations, the evidence was undeniable. The sea was eating the land. Around 10,000 BCE, Doggerland stood at its greatest extent during the post-glacial period. The ice sheets were retreating, but still massive. Much water remained locked in glacial ice. The landscape stretched nearly unbroken from what is now Yorkshire across to the Netherlands and Denmark. Rivers flowed west through valleys toward the Atlantic. Then the melt accelerated. Geological records show the early Holocene experienced pulses of rapid warming. Each warm period triggered accelerated melting of the remaining ice sheets. When ice melts, that water has to go somewhere. It goes into the oceans. Sea level rise during this period was dramatic by any standard. Studies of sediment cores and ancient shorelines indicate rates of 1 to 2 meters per century in some periods. That may not sound like much, but across a flat coastal plain, 1 meter of sea level rise can translate to kilometers of coastline lost. For the people living in Doggerland, this created slow-motion catastrophe. The best hunting grounds were often the low-lying wetlands where game congregated. These areas were the first to flood. Seasonal camps near the coast had to be abandoned and rebuilt farther inland. Territories shrank. By 9000 BCE, the southern and eastern portions of Doggerland were submerging. The Thames Valley, once a river flowing west across the southern plain, began to flood from its lower reaches upward. The Rhine Delta, which had extended far west of the modern Dutch coast, retreated eastward. Islands began to form. Archaeological evidence from this period is frustratingly sparse because the sites are underwater. But we can infer from what's happening. Populations had to move. The richest territories, those coastal zones where fresh water met salt water, where shellfish and fish were abundant, where migrating birds stopped, were disappearing beneath the waves. This would have created pressure, more people competing for less territory. Bands that had held traditional territories for generations found those territories literally vanishing. Where did they go? Inland, presumably. But inland territories were already occupied. Some researchers suggest this pressure drove technological innovation. The Mesolithic period sees increasingly sophisticated fishing technology. Better boats allowed exploitation of deeper waters. Fish weirs and traps became more elaborate. Perhaps this was adaptation to changing circumstances, using technology to compensate for lost territory. The flooding wasn't uniform. Doggerland's geography meant some areas survived longer than others. The Dogger Bank, a raised area of land, remained above water even as the surrounding plains submerged. By 8500 BCE, it had become an island, possibly a large island, perhaps hundreds of square kilometers in area. This island must have been valuable territory. Surrounded by sea but with its own freshwater sources, springs, perhaps small streams draining from the higher ground. Resources from both land and sea would have been available. It's tempting to imagine communities adapting, becoming maritime people, using boats to reach the mainland, maintaining connections across increasingly wide channels. The strait separating the island from what we now call England widened year by year. The channel to the east, toward the continental mainland, grew broader. Eventually, crossing would have required boats capable of open water sailing. Not impossible. Mesolithic people certainly had watercraft, but increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, another transformation was occurring. The land itself was moving. This sounds strange, but it's real. During the Ice Age, the weight of glaciers pressed the Earth's crust downward. When the ice melted, that pressure released. The land began to rebound, slowly rising back up. This process, called isostatic adjustment, is still ongoing in some regions today. Scotland, which bore the thickest ice, began rising. The rate is measurable, about 1 to 2 millimeters per year in some areas. This sounds trivial, but over centuries, it adds up. However, this created an unexpected problem for Doggerland. The land acted somewhat like a seesaw. As Scotland rose, the southern North Sea region tilted downward. The geological rebound that helped Scotland actually accelerated Doggerland's drowning. Sediment cores show the progression. Lower layers represent terrestrial environments, soil, peat, lake deposits. Middle layers show brackish conditions, saltwater mixing with fresh, indicating the sea was encroaching. Upper layers are fully marine sediments. The story is written in the mud. Communities adapted as long as they could. They moved their settlements to higher ground. They shifted their economic focus from interior hunting to coastal resources. They became more dependent on fish and shellfish. But there are limits to adaptation. Eventually, there simply wasn't enough land left. By 7000 BCE, Doggerland had been reduced to a scattered archipelago. The Dogger Bank remained the largest island, but other high points still projected above the water. These islands would have been small, perhaps a few square kilometers each. Enough for a band to survive, but not much more. The psychological impact must have been profound. Imagine knowing your grandparents spoke of places that no longer exist. Hunting grounds your father knew were now underwater. The land itself was failing. This wasn't something that could be fought. You can't battle the sea. Some populations may have developed creation stories or flood myths to explain what was happening. The tale of a world that once existed but was lost to water appears in many cultures. While we have no direct evidence of Doggerland people's beliefs, it's reasonable to suppose they told stories about the changing world. Trade networks that had spanned Doggerland for millennia began to break down. What had been a walk across dry land now required dangerous sea crossings. Contact between communities on opposite shores of the widening channels became less frequent. Cultural divergence began. The people in what would become Britain started developing distinct traditions from those on the continental mainland. This separation had genetic consequences. DNA analysis shows that around this period, the genetic composition of populations on either side of the emerging North Sea began to diverge. Gene flow didn't stop completely. Boats could still make crossings, but it slowed dramatically. The environmental changes affected more than just humans. The megafauna of the Ice Age were already in decline. Mammoths vanished from the region. Woolly rhinoceros disappeared. The cold-adapted species couldn't survive in the warming, forested environment. New animals arrived. Forest specialists like wild boar and red deer flourished, but the spectacular diversity of the Ice Age was gone. For the remaining inhabitants of Doggerland's shrinking islands, life became increasingly precarious. They were entirely dependent on marine resources. A bad fishing season could mean starvation. Storms could isolate them for extended periods. The populations were too small to maintain genetic diversity long term. And then, around 6200 BC, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Not a slow rise of the sea, but something sudden and catastrophic, something that would redefine the map of northern Europe in a single terrible day. The Storegga Slide, a tsunami and a turning point. Off the coast of what is now Norway, the continental shelf drops away into the deep Norwegian Sea. For thousands of years following the Ice Age, this underwater slope had been accumulating sediment. The retreating glaciers left behind vast amounts of debris, clay, sand, gravel. Layer upon layer built up on the slope. The sediment was unstable. Mixed within it were methane hydrates, ice-like substances that trap methane gas. These form under specific conditions of cold temperature and high pressure. They're stable when undisturbed, but change the conditions and they can destabilize catastrophically. Around 6200 BCE, something triggered a collapse. The exact mechanism remains debated. Perhaps an earthquake. Perhaps accumulated methane reached a critical point and expanded suddenly, breaking the slope's stability. Perhaps it was simply the weight of accumulated sediment reaching a threshold. Whatever the trigger, the result was devastating. A section of seafloor nearly 300 kilometers long suddenly failed. The Storegga Slide, as geologists now call it, involved an estimated 3,500 cubic kilometers of material. That's difficult to visualize. Picture an area the size of Iceland sliding down an underwater mountain. The debris field extends hundreds of kilometers out into the deep Norwegian basin. When that much material moves that suddenly underwater, it displaces an enormous volume of water. A tsunami forms, not the relatively small waves that earthquakes generate, but a mega tsunami. The initial wave height may have reached 20 to 30 meters near the slide source. The tsunami radiated outward across the Norwegian Sea and into the North Sea. The coastline of Norway took the first impact. Geological evidence shows run-up, the height water reached inland of 10 to 15 meters in some locations. Communities living along that coast would have had no warning. The wave would have struck perhaps 20 to 30 minutes after the slide. Anyone near the shore would have perished. The wave traveled south and west, spreading as it went. By the time it reached the Shetland and Orkney Islands, it was still perhaps 5 to 6 meters high. These islands would have been devastated. Coastal settlements wiped away. The Scottish mainland's eastern coast experienced waves 4 to 5 meters above normal high tide, penetrating up to 20 kilometers inland in low-lying areas. For Doggerland, the impact was catastrophic. The archipelago of low islands had minimal elevation above sea level. Recent research suggests much of the remaining land was already at or barely above high tide level. The tsunami struck with full force. Sediment cores from the southern North Sea contain evidence of the event. A distinctive layer of sand mixed with debris appears at the right chronological level, material that could only have been deposited by a large wave. The layer is thick in some locations, but thinner in others, depending on topography. But it's there, marking the day the wave came. The human cost is impossible to calculate precisely. Some researchers estimate that up to a quarter of the Mesolithic population living around the North Sea basin may have perished. This seems high, but consider the circumstances. Coastal communities bore the brunt. Those living on Doggerland's remaining islands had nowhere to run. The wave wouldn't have been a single crest. Tsunamis arrive as a series of waves, sometimes hours apart. The first might not have been the largest. People who survived the initial impact and fled inland might have returned to coastal areas, only to be caught by subsequent waves. The water didn't just rise and recede. It surged back and forth multiple times, eroding shorelines and carrying debris. For survivors, the aftermath was traumatic. The landscape was transformed overnight. Islands that existed the previous day were gone. Coastal areas were scoured of vegetation. Bodies, human and animal, littered the shore. Freshwater sources were contaminated with salt. Food stores were destroyed. Yet the tsunami, devastating as it was, didn't end Doggerland completely. This is one of the most important recent discoveries. For decades, researchers assumed the Storegga tsunami was the final blow, the event that submerged the last of Doggerland. But detailed topographical reconstructions and sediment analysis tell a different story. Some high points survived. The Dogger Hills, the central elevated region, remained above water after the tsunami receded. These areas might even have been sheltered somewhat by the topography of the surrounding submerged plains, which could have dissipated some of the wave's energy. The tsunami's immediate devastation was followed by a more insidious aftermath. The wave had pushed salt water far inland, soils were contaminated, vegetation withered. It would have taken years for the land to recover, for rain to flush the salt from the earth, for plants to recolonize. During that time, the islands would have been barely habitable. Archaeological evidence from sites on the periphery of the impact zone shows something interesting. There's a gap in occupation at many locations, sites abandoned around the time of Storegga. But then, after perhaps a generation, reoccupation begins. People returned. Life continued. For Doggerland survivors, the options were limited. Some may have fled to the mainland, either to Britain or to continental Europe. Crossing the channels would have been dangerous, especially in the aftermath of the tsunami when weather patterns were disrupted. But boats were available, and the alternative was remaining on increasingly marginal land. Others stayed. The archaeological record suggests some islands remained occupied after the Storegga event. These communities would have been isolated, living in harsh conditions, but surviving. They were the last Doggerlanders, living on borrowed time as the sea continued its inexorable rise. The tsunami marked a cultural as well as geographical boundary. The networks that had connected communities across the southern North Sea were severed. What had been a coherent cultural region fragmented. The people who remained on the British side of the widening channels began developing distinctively British Mesolithic cultures. Those on the continental side followed their own trajectories. Genetic evidence supports this. DNA analysis shows reduced gene flow between Britain and the continent after this period. The populations didn't completely lose contact, but intermarriage and regular exchange dropped dramatically. Britain was becoming an island, not just geographically, but culturally and genetically. The Storegga Slide had one final consequence that wouldn't be felt for centuries. The evidence of catastrophic flooding entered the cultural memory of peoples around the North Sea. While we can't prove direct transmission, many Northern European cultures have flood myths. Stories of a great wave that destroyed an ancient world appear again and again. Perhaps these stories preserve garbled memories of actual events passed down through oral tradition for 8,000 years. Modern researchers study Storegga for reasons beyond historical interest. It provides a case study in submarine landslides and tsunami generation. As climate continues to warm and ice sheets melt, the risk of similar events elsewhere increases. Understanding what happened at Storegga helps predict future dangers. The slide scar remains visible in seismic surveys of the Norwegian continental margin. It's one of the largest submarine landslides ever documented. The tsunami it generated was among the largest in recorded geological history, and it struck at the worst possible moment for Doggerland, when the land was already on the edge, already fragmented, already struggling. The wave didn't end Doggerland in a day. But it was the beginning of the end. The final chapter was about to begin. The last stand, the final inundation of Doggerland. The final centuries of Doggerland tell a story of gradual contraction, punctuated by sudden catastrophe. By the time the Storegga tsunami struck around 6200 BCE, most of Doggerland was already gone. This is crucial to understand. The tsunami didn't destroy a thriving landmass. It struck what remained of an already drowning world. The Great Inundation had been underway for millennia. Sea levels rose relentlessly as the ice sheets melted. Between 8000 BCE and 6500 BCE, the southern and eastern portions of Doggerland submerged completely. What had been continuous land fragmented into an archipelago. By the time Storegga occurred, only scattered islands remained, high points that still projected above the rising waters. The tsunami devastated these remaining islands. But the final transformation continued over the following centuries as sea levels kept rising. The period between 6200 BC and 5000 BCE saw the last remnants disappear. What had been islands became shoals. What had been shoals became seamounts. The land vanished beneath the waves section by section, year by year, until nothing remained above the surface. The process wasn't uniform. Different areas went under at different times. Topographical reconstructions based on sediment cores and seismic data allow researchers to track the progression. The tsunami-damaged southern islands submerged within centuries of Storegga. The northern reaches, including the Dogger Hills, held out longer as the final refuge. For communities on these final islands after the tsunami, life became increasingly difficult. Territory was already limited before Storegga struck. Afterward, it was even more constricted. Resources diminished. Population density on the remaining land increased beyond sustainable levels. At some point, the islands simply couldn't support human habitation anymore. We can imagine the decisions facing these people: stay and risk everything, or leave for the uncertain prospects of the mainland. Leaving meant taking to the sea in small boats, crossing channels that had grown into significant water barriers. For a community, this would mean multiple trips, carrying not just people but whatever possessions could be salvaged. Dogs, tools, dried food stores, everything essential would need to be transported. The crossing to what is now the eastern coast of England would have been perhaps 30 to 50 kilometers by this late stage, depending on which island served as the starting point. Not impossible, but dangerous. The North Sea, even in summer, can turn violent quickly. Storms could appear with little warning. A boat caught in rough water faced real danger, yet people made these crossings. We know this because the populations of the Britain didn't decline during this period. Archaeological evidence shows increased settlement density along the eastern British coast during the late 7th and 6th millennia BCE. The influx of refugees from the drowning islands likely contributed to this population growth. The continental side received refugees too. The Dutch and Danish coasts show similar patterns: increased occupation in areas that would have been accessible from Doggerland. People didn't simply vanish. They moved. They adapted. They survived by abandoning their homeland and integrating into mainland communities. But not everyone left immediately after Storegga. Some stayed on the surviving high ground. The Dogger Bank, the highest point of the entire region, remained above water longest. Recent estimates suggest it survived as an island until approximately 5000 BCE, possibly even later. For more than 1,000 years after the tsunami and the submersion of most other Doggerland territories, this one elevated area persisted above the waves. What was life like on this final refuge? Archaeology hasn't yet found direct evidence. The sites remain underwater and buried. But we can make reasonable inferences based on the environmental constraints. The island would have been entirely dependent on the sea. No large land animals could have survived there. Fishing, shellfish gathering, and hunting sea mammals would have been the only food sources aside from whatever plants could be foraged or possibly cultivated. The population must have been small. An island perhaps 10-20 kilometers across could support maybe a few hundred people at most, likely fewer. These would have been the most isolated community in northwestern Europe, surrounded by water, increasingly cut off from the mainland populations. Did they maintain contact with Britain and the continent? Possibly. Skilled boat operators could make the crossing in favorable weather. Trade might have continued sporadically. But each year, the crossing got longer as sea levels rose and the island's shores eroded. Eventually, regular contact would have become impossible. These final islanders might have developed unique cultural traits. Isolation often does that. Language could have diverged. Tool-making traditions might have evolved differently. Social structures in such a small, isolated population would necessarily be different from mainland communities. We'll probably never know the details. Those final decades or centuries of occupation left no archaeological trace that's yet been found. The end, when it came, was probably not dramatic. Bird migration routes altered. The emergence of the North Sea had ecological implications that reached far beyond the immediate area. For Britain, the isolation had profound consequences. For thousands of years, populations had moved freely between the island and the continent. Genetic exchange was continuous. Cultural innovations spread rapidly. Now, that connection was severed. Britain was on its own. This isolation shaped subsequent history. When agriculture arrived in northwestern Europe from the Near East around 4000 BCE, it spread rapidly across the continent. But reaching Britain required crossing the Channel. This didn't prevent agriculture from arriving, but it delayed it. Britain remained a hunter-gatherer society for several centuries after the continent had adopted farming. Some researchers argue this delay had long-term effects. By the time agriculture reached Britain, it was a mature technology package. The earliest British farmers weren't pioneers experimenting with new techniques. They were experienced agriculturalists who brought complete knowledge systems with them. This might explain why the transition in Britain, when it finally occurred, happened relatively quickly. The genetic legacy of Doggerland's people persists. DNA analysis of modern populations shows that Mesolithic ancestry contributes to the genetic makeup of people living around the North Sea today. The refugees who left the drowning islands integrated into mainland populations. Their descendants are still here. Here. There's something poignant about the end of Doggerland. It wasn't conquered. It wasn't destroyed by war or plague. It simply drowned. Climate change and rising sea levels erased it as thoroughly as if it had never existed. For 8,000 years, only the occasional artifact dredged by fishing nets hinted at what had been lost. The people who lived through the final stages of Doggerland's submersion, from the pre-Storegga archipelago through the tsunami's devastation to the eventual disappearance of the last islands, experienced something profoundly disorienting. They witnessed the literal end of their world across multiple generations. The land itself, the permanent seeming ground, proved impermanent. Everything their ancestors had known changed fundamentally. They adapted. They survived. They moved on and built new lives in new places. Their resilience is remarkable. But the loss was real. A landscape that had supported human communities for thousands of years, that had been home to countless individuals, that had accumulated layers of meaning and memory, all gone beneath the waves. And now, 8 millennia later, we're trying to recover what was lost. Using technology that would seem like magic to the Doggerlanders, we're mapping their world, finding their artifacts, learning their stories. The land is gone, but the knowledge of it is returning. Dredging up the past, the modern search for evidence. The recovery of Doggerland began with an accident. Those fishermen in 1931 didn't set out to discover a lost world. They were simply trawling for fish. The barbed antler point that came up in their nets was a curiosity, nothing more, until someone recognized what it meant. Since then, hundreds of artifacts have been recovered from the North Sea. Most are chance finds brought up by commercial fishing operations that have no interest in archaeology. Trawl nets dragged across the seabed snag objects. When nets are emptied, anything unusual gets noticed. If the crew knows to report such finds, they make their way to researchers. The range of materials is remarkable. Stone tools, hand axes, scraped flakes, microliths appear regularly. These are diagnostic artifacts. Trained archaeologists can often identify when and where they were made based on their style and manufacturing technique. Some date to the Paleolithic period, 40,000 years or more ago. Others are clearly Mesolithic, from the final millennia before inundation. Bone and antler artifacts survive surprisingly well in the oxygen-free sediments of the North Sea. Harpoon points, needles, decorated implements, all have been recovered. Some show exquisite craftsmanship. The barbs on fishing spears are carved with precision. Decorative patterns on bone tools suggest aesthetic sensibilities beyond mere function. Wooden artifacts are rarer but not unknown. The seabed sediments can preserve wood if conditions are right. Fragments of what may be tool handles, structural elements from dwellings, or worked wood have appeared. Each find adds to our understanding of Mesolithic technology. Then there are the bones. Lots of bones. Mammoth tusks and teeth are fairly common finds. Woolly rhinoceros skulls and limb bones. Red deer antlers. Aurochs vertebrae. Lion teeth. The fossil assemblage represents thousands of years of accumulation, animals that perished in the region and whose remains settled into river sediments or were buried in marsh deposits. What makes these finds particularly valuable is that they can be precisely dated using radiocarbon methods. Organic materials up to about 50,000 years old can be dated this way. Each dated specimen provides a data point. It tells us this species was in this area at this time. Build up enough data points and patterns emerge. Human remains are rare but extraordinary when found. The jawbone discovered in 2009, containing DNA that could be sequenced, represented a major breakthrough. This was an actual Doggerlander, not someone from the periphery, but from the lost land itself. The isotope analysis revealing his diet, the DNA showing his ancestry, these details bring us as close as we're likely to get to meeting these people. Other human remains have surfaced, fragments of skull, individual teeth, a femur. Each is studied intensively. What age was this person? What was their health status? What can we learn about their life? Even small fragments can yield information. Some remains show marks that suggest ritual treatment, cut marks on human bones that don't match butchery patterns seen on animal bones. These post-mortem modifications hint at complex funerary practices. Perhaps secondary burial, where bodies were exposed first, then bones were collected and reburied. Perhaps something else entirely. The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. The Netherlands has become a focal point for Doggerland research, largely due to ongoing land reclamation projects. For decades, the Dutch have been pumping sand from the North Sea onto their beaches to combat erosion and create new land. This process brings up enormous quantities of sediment. Mixed in that sediment are artifacts. After storms, when pumped sand has been disturbed by waves, collectors walk the beaches looking for finds. It's become something of a local tradition. People know what to look for. A worked flint stands out from natural stones. Bone tools have a different texture than modern debris. Many important discoveries have been made this way. Luc Amkreutz, a curator at the Dutch National Museum of Antiquities, works with these collectors. He's helped establish protocols for reporting finds and has assembled one of the most significant collections of Doggerland artifacts in existence. His work demonstrates that crowdsourced archaeology can be scientifically rigorous. The artifacts tell stories if you know how to read them. A hafted stone point shows how it was attached to a wooden shaft. Marks on bone tools reveal how they were used. Wear patterns on teeth indicate diet. Each object is a document containing information about the people who made and used it. But artifacts alone can only tell us so much. What researchers really want are settlement sites, places where people actually lived. These would contain far more information than scattered finds. Multiple artifact types in association, spatial patterns showing how activities were organized, evidence of structures, potentially preserved organic materials that would allow detailed environmental reconstruction. Finding such sites in the North Sea has proven extraordinarily difficult. The challenge isn't just that they're underwater, it's that they're buried under meters of marine sediment and spread across an area the size of England. It's like searching for specific houses in a city when the entire city is underwater, covered in mud, and you don't know exactly where in a region the size of a country it's located. Recent research expeditions have started addressing this challenge systematically. In 2019 and 2020, the Europe's Lost Frontiers project sent research vessels into the North Sea specifically to survey for Doggerland evidence. They used remote sensing equipment to map the seabed. They collected sediment cores from targeted locations. They employed techniques developed for deep-sea archaeology. The work is painstaking. Each core extracted requires processing in specialized labs. Samples must be analyzed for pollen, microscopic organisms, chemical signatures. Material must be dated. The data from each core must be integrated with seismic surveys and other cores to build comprehensive environmental reconstructions. The results have been impressive. One core extracted from what was identified through seismic survey as an ancient river system contained a nearly complete environmental sequence spanning several thousand years. The layers told the story of how that location changed from terrestrial to marine over time. Most significantly, one layer contained clear evidence of the Storegga tsunami, a deposit of sand and debris that could only have been laid down by a massive wave. This kind of direct physical evidence is crucial. It allows researchers to test hypotheses. The theory that Storegga caused catastrophic flooding of Doggerland could be verified by finding tsunami deposits in cores from the region. The discovery confirmed the event occurred and provides data on its magnitude. Other expeditions have focused on different questions. What was the salinity of water bodies at different periods? This indicates whether they were freshwater lakes or coastal lagoons. When exactly did different areas submerge? Precise dating of the transition from terrestrial to marine sediments provides this information. Technology continues to advance. Autonomous underwater vehicles can now survey large areas more efficiently than towed sensors. Higher resolution seismic equipment reveals finer details. DNA analysis techniques improve, allowing recovery of genetic material from smaller samples and more degraded sources. There's growing hope that a settlement site will be found within the next decade. Researchers now have good enough landscape reconstructions to predict where such sites should be. They can identify ancient river valleys, lake shores, elevated areas, exactly the kinds of locations Mesolithic people favored for camps. The challenge is confirming findings. You can't just dive down and excavate like you would on land. The depths are too great, visibility is poor, the sink and the logistics are complex. If a probable site is identified, it would likely require a major, well-funded expedition using specialized equipment. But it's no longer impossible. It's merely difficult and expensive. The recovered artifacts, meanwhile, continue to accumulate. Museums around the North Sea maintain collections. Researchers study them using increasingly sophisticated techniques: DNA analysis, isotope studies, microscopic examination of tool wear patterns. Each method extracts new information from old finds. Every object that comes from the seabed is a message from the past. The people who made these things are long gone. The land they lived on is gone. But their artifacts remain, scattered across the seafloor, waiting to be found. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, bringing us closer to understanding the lost world beneath the waves. Doggerland's legacy, sunken landscapes, and a climate warning. Doggerland is gone, but its importance is very much present. This isn't just an interesting historical curiosity. The story of Doggerland connects directly to some of the most pressing challenges facing our world today. Start with the basic facts. For thousands of years, a landscape supported thriving human communities. Then climate change caused ice sheets to melt. Sea levels rose, the land drowned, populations were displaced. The geography of an entire region transformed fundamentally. This isn't speculation or projection. It happened. The rate of sea level rise during Doggerland's drowning varied, but peaked at 1 to 2 meters per century during the most rapid phases. That's roughly 10 to 20 millimeters per year, about the current rate of global sea level rise. What took Doggerland centuries to experience, low-lying coastal regions today face on similar timescales. The parallels are uncomfortable. The Netherlands, where so many Doggerland artifacts wash ashore, knows this intimately. Much of the country sits below sea level, protected by extensive dike systems and active water management. The Dutch have been fighting the sea for centuries, but they're fighting an opponent that's growing stronger. Bangladesh faces similar challenges. Millions live on land barely above sea level. A 1-meter rise would displace perhaps 20 million people. Pacific Island nations face existential threats. Major cities worldwide, Miami, Shanghai, Mumbai, New York, have extensive infrastructure in zones vulnerable to flooding. Doggerland demonstrates that geography is not permanent. Coastlines that seem stable can change dramatically within a few generations. Land that has been continuously inhabited for millennia can become uninhabitable. This has happened before. It can happen again. The refugee flows from Doggerland offer another uncomfortable parallel. When their land became uninhabitable, people moved. They had no choice. They crossed dangerous waters in small boats, seeking refuge in territories that were already occupied. Some integrated successfully, But the process must have created tension, competition for resources, cultural conflict. Today, climate migration is already occurring. People leave areas affected by drought, flood, or other climate related disasters. Current estimates suggest climate change could displace hundreds of millions of people by the end of this century. Where will they go? How will receiving areas respond? These aren't hypothetical questions, they're urgent challenges that require planning and compassion. Doggerland also offers lessons about adaptation. The Mesolithic people didn't simply give up. They adjusted their lifestyle to changing conditions. They became more dependent on maritime resources. They developed better watercraft. They maintained social networks across increasingly challenging geography. Their resilience is remarkable. But there are limits to adaptation. Eventually, the Doggerlanders ran out of land. No amount of technological cleverness or social flexibility could compensate for the physical loss of territory. They survived by migrating. That option existed because mainland areas could absorb the refugee populations. With modern population densities, absorbing large-scale climate refugees is exponentially more difficult. The scientific study of Doggerland has advanced tremendously over the past 2 decades. What was once a vague concept is now a mapped landscape with documented environmental history. Researchers can track how ecosystems changed when different areas submerged, how human populations responded. This knowledge base provides data for modeling similar processes in the present and future. Marine archaeologists have developed new techniques through Doggerland research. Methods for finding submerged sites, extracting information from underwater sediments, and reconstructing drowned landscapes are all advancing. These techniques have applications beyond Doggerland. As sea levels continue rising, more archaeological sites will be threatened or submerged. The methods being refined in the North Sea will be needed worldwide. Doggerland research also connects to broader questions about human response to environmental change. The Mesolithic period saw major ecological transformations. The megafauna vanished, forests replaced grasslands, sea levels rose, human cultures adapted repeatedly. Understanding how past populations handled major environmental shifts provides context for current challenges. Some researchers argue that the displacement of Doggerland populations influenced the eventual adoption of agriculture in Britain. The trauma of losing their homeland, the crowding of refugee populations into smaller territories, the breakdown of traditional resource management systems. These stresses might have created conditions where the agricultural package, when it finally arrived, was more appealing than it would have been otherwise. This is speculative, but worth considering. Major disruptions can create openness to radical change. When traditional ways of life become impossible, people explore alternatives. The arrival of agriculture in Britain coincided with a period of social upheaval related to the final loss of Doggerland. That timing might not be coincidental. The story also illuminates the deep history of the North Sea itself. This body of water, so familiar to modern Europeans, is geologically very young. 8,000 years ago, it didn't exist in its current form. Understanding its formation helps us grasp how dynamic Earth's geography truly is. For local communities around the North Sea, Doggerland has become part of regional identity. It's their Atlantis, but real. Coastal museums feature Doggerland exhibits. Schools teach local children about the drowned landscape. The artifacts that wash onto beaches connect people to a deep past that's literally underfoot, or rather under wave. The cultural impact extends to literature and art. Novelists have written speculative fiction about Doggerland's final days. Artists create visualizations of the lost landscape. Musicians compose works inspired by the story. The drowned world captures imagination in ways that purely scientific accounts cannot. There's something mythic about Doggerland, even though it's documented fact. A lost paradise, a golden age destroyed by inexorable forces, the last people watching their world slip beneath the waves. These are the elements of legend, but they're also what actually happened. Reality and myth converge. Looking forward, Doggerland research continues to expand. New technologies promise even greater insights. Environmental DNA sampling from sediment cores might reveal what species lived in the region without requiring actual fossils. Improved seismic imaging could identify features currently too subtle to detect. Machine learning algorithms could help process the enormous datasets involved in mapping the drowned landscape. The quest for a preserved settlement site continues. Several candidate locations have been identified. The logistics and funding for a major underwater excavation are challenging, but not impossible. If a site is found and properly investigated, it could revolutionize our understanding of Mesolithic life. Building layouts, food remains, complete tool assemblages, possibly even preserved organic materials like clothing or basketry, all potentially waiting on the seafloor. International collaboration has been crucial to Doggerland research. British, Dutch, Belgian, German, Danish, and Norwegian researchers work together, sharing data and resources. The drowned landscape lies under international waters in some areas, beneath national waters in others. Cooperation is essential. This collaboration models how archaeological research can transcend national boundaries to address shared heritage. The funding has come from diverse sources. Academic grants support much of the basic research. Oil and gas companies, whose seismic data made the mapping possible, have sometimes provided direct support. Wind farm developments, which require extensive seabed surveys, create opportunities for archaeological work. Even the fishing industry has contributed by reporting finds and allowing researchers aboard vessels. There's an urgency to this work. Climate change threatens not just future landscapes, but also archaeological sites. As seas continue rising, coastal archaeological sites worldwide face erosion and destruction. The methods and approaches developed for studying Doggerland will be needed to document and understand sites before they're lost. Doggerland's final lesson might be about memory. For 8,000 years, this landscape was forgotten. Only scattered myths hinted at lands lost to water. Then modern science recovered what had been lost. The landscape can't be restored, but knowledge of it can be regained. This gives us responsibility. We know what happened to Doggerland. We understand the mechanisms. We can see similar processes beginning today. The question is whether we'll learn from this prehistoric example or repeat its patterns at vastly larger scale. The people of Doggerland didn't cause their own displacement. They had no control over the melting ice sheets or rising seas. They were victims of planetary scale processes. Today's climate change is different. We understand the causes. We have agency. The choice of whether future generations face Doggerland scale displacement is substantially in our hands. Walking the beaches where Doggerland artifacts wash ashore, you can't help but reflect on impermanence. The ground beneath our feet is temporary. The coastlines we know will change. The climate that has been relatively stable for the past few thousand years is shifting. Nothing is guaranteed to remain. But Doggerland also demonstrates persistence. The land is gone, but its story survives. The people were displaced, but their descendants continued. Knowledge was lost, then recovered. There's resilience in that. Human capacity to adapt, survive, remember, and rebuild. The drowned landscape beneath the North Sea is a warning and an inspiration. A warning of what can be lost when climate changes faster than ecosystems can adapt. An inspiration in showing how much we can learn, how deeply we can reach into the past to recover what seemed irretrievably lost. Doggerland is gone, but through scientific effort, human curiosity, and technological capability, we're bringing it back. Not the physical land, that's beyond recovery, but the knowledge of it, the understanding of who lived there, how they lived, what they faced, how they responded. Every artifact pulled from the seabed is a victory over forgetting. Every sediment core analyzed is another piece of the story recovered. Every map refined brings the lost landscape into clearer focus. The world that drowned 8 millennia ago lives again in our reconstructions, our understanding, our memory. And perhaps that's the most important legacy. Doggerland reminds us that nothing lasts forever, but that doesn't mean nothing matters. The people who lived there mattered. Their lives had meaning. Their adaptations show human resilience. Their displacement warns us of costs yet to come. Their story, once lost but now recovered, teaches us to look backward and forward simultaneously, learning from the past to inform the future. The search continues. The seas keep their secrets, but slowly, patiently, we're recovering them. Somewhere beneath the dark waters of the North Sea, more evidence waits. More artifacts lie buried in the sediment. Perhaps a settlement site preserved in oxygen-free mud. Perhaps human remains that will tell us even more about the Doggerlanders. Perhaps evidence we can't yet imagine. The lost world of Doggerland speaks across 8,000 years. It tells of paradise found and paradise lost, of human adaptation and human displacement, of landscapes that changed and people who survived, of memory recovered from beneath the waves. It's a story that resonates because it's not really over. Doggerland's drowning was one chapter in an ongoing narrative about climate, geography, and human societies. We're living another chapter now. The lessons from the sunken landscape remain urgently relevant. Britain's Atlantis beneath the North Sea is more than a fascinating archaeological puzzle. It's a mirror reflecting our own challenges, a cautionary tale written in sediment and stone, a testament to what can be lost and what can be recovered, a reminder that the relationship between land and sea, between climate and civilization, is always in flux. And perhaps most importantly, Doggerland demonstrates that even when the physical landscape is lost, the human story endures. Through careful study, persistent inquiry, and technological innovation, we can reach back across millennia to understand who came before. Their world is gone, but their legacy remains in our genes, in our cultural memory, and now increasingly in our scientific understanding. The waves continue their eternal rhythm above the drowned landscape. The trawlers drag their nets across the seabed. Storms shift the sediment, and occasionally, impossibly, an artifact emerges, a tool shaped by human hands 8,000 years ago, a message from the lost world beneath the waves, a connection across the vast gulf of time. Doggerland was real. Its people were real. Their lives, their struggles, their achievements were real. And now, through the work of archaeologists, geologists, and countless others, we can know their story. The land may be lost, but the knowledge lives on. That is Doggerland's true legacy, proof that even sunken worlds can be remembered, understood, and honored.